Okay, good afternoon. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and welcome to another session of Urban Management. Um, Please scan the QR code in front of you to mark your attendance if you haven't done so already. Otherwise, I'll display the QR code again once, just before we finish our session today. Right, so this week, as I promised, we will be talking about urban management instruments, which include strategic plans and action plans. Some of you may be aware of other instruments, other urban management instruments, or other urban management approaches. But for this session, or for this course, we'll focus on strategic plans and action plans. And in this session, I want to specifically focus on the strategic plan itself. If you are to define what a strategic plan is, then a strategic plan is a deliberative, disciplined effort to produce fundamental decisions and actions that shape and guide what an organization is, what it does, and why. However, in the context of urban regional planning, especially urban management, a strategic plan is a document that elaborates efforts to overcome or efforts to produce solutions to urban management or urban development challenges. And of course, not only does it offer solutions, but also presents an argument of why that solution was chosen, and what implications do these proposed solutions have, or are anticipated to have. Now, let's go back a little bit and talk about the history and application of strategic plans. Now, initially, strategic planning concepts, procedures, tools, and practices were developed in the for-profit sector or the private sector. It was only about 40 years ago that the public sector began employing strategic planning. And strategic planning can be applied to organizations or parts of an organization. It could also be applied to intra-organizational functions within, for example, it can be applied to different divisions within an organization, like the finance division or the human resources division, because each of these divisions may have their own separate goals, but still under the greater goal of the organization as a whole. In our case, then, strategic plans describe purpose-driven inter-organizational networks or collaborations that are designed to fulfill specific functions, such as the provision and maintenance of transportation networks and infrastructure, the provision of health services, public health services, the provision and maintenance of educational facilities, and or the provision and maintenance of emergency services networks. Anything that is and all other different functions and other different functions and services that are provided by local, provincial, or central government. And as I mentioned, local, municipal, or provincial or central government, then you can already imagine that strategic planning can be applied at a small, medium, or a much larger geographical scale and scope. Now, as I mentioned, it was only about 4 decades ago that the public sector began employing strategic planning. And strategic planning in the public sector help decide what their organization should be doing, why and how, and it also helps with accountability and compliance. And it is clear that strategic planning is undertaken to maximize enterprise-wide or subunit effectiveness in terms of profit, market share, and other business-related outcomes in the private sector. In the public sector, in the public sector, strategic planning is usually employed to align the different goals of different government agencies. Strategic planning is also employed to ensure continuity of effort. Now, a little added point on this continuity of effort. Usually, as far as I know, here, when we have a change of leadership, whether it be in the urban government or whether it be in public sector agencies, such as our university. Whenever we have leadership changes, there will be a lot of policy changes, policy adjustments, and some programs that were initiated by the previous administration gets discontinued. So ideally, we have a strategic plan to ensure that the continuity of these efforts, so that we can see a sustainable and effective and efficient delivery of services and a sustainable organizational development as well. Throughout, regardless of who's captain of the boat, so to say. Other than that, in the public sector, performance-related effectiveness is also another important reason for undertaking strategic planning. And as I mentioned, accountability and compliance. When you publish a strategic plan, or when you make your organization's strategic plan public, then you are also implying that your organization is transparent, that is accountable, and what I meant by compliance is, I think nowadays the government is increasingly asking for its agencies, for its subordinates to provide strategic and action plans. So organizational strategic plans and organizational action plans, which are regularly updated. So, as we move on, I'd like to bring your attention to this strategic planning versus rational comprehensive planning. Well, versus in quote unquote. Bryson et al. Mentioned that strategic planning does not equal rational comprehensive planning. They sort of distinguish between the two. So they you can read all about this in Bryson et al. Getting strategic about strategic planning research, which I have made available in Classroom. But I'm just giving you an overview of what they did. and why they sort of distinguish between rational comprehensive planning, which they also call, or which they also refer to as the root method, and strategic planning, which they refer to sometimes as the branch method. So in rational comprehensive planning, the clarification of values or objectives are distinct. So each so every goal or every objective every objective that should be attained, that should be achieved that should be completed to achieve the organization's main goal is usually very distinct. So they're very clear and they're very distinct from one another. And policy formulation is approached through means-end analysis. In other words, they view the policies or the regulations that they produce as a means to an end, as an instrument to achieving the end result that they're expecting. So the third point that they made is that good policy is the most appropriate means to desired ends. Just like point number 2, they view policy as a means, as an instrument to achieve the desired end or the desired result. And that in rational comprehensive planning, as the name suggests, there's a comprehensive analysis to feed or to help develop the policies. And in rational comprehensive planning, theory is often heavily relied upon. On the contrary, strategic planning, or the branch method, the selection of goals and analysis of needed actions are closely intertwined. So rather than being distinctly separate from one another, they are usually intertwined. They're usually connected in some ways or another. And what it means by, and what they meant by limited means end analysis is that it's not that the analysis is not in depth, but limited means end analysis means that they're focused. They are more focused on a certain goal, or they are more focused on a certain solution or a certain issue that they want to solve, that they want to resolve, so that it's a limited scope, but a much more in-depth analysis. Again, contrasting rational comprehensive planning, good policy in strategic planning is the policy or the solution that is agreed upon by various analysts. So because most of the time when you're coming up with a strategic plan, it's not just one. It doesn't just involve one actor, but it usually involves several stakeholders, and each with their own significance and contribution to the organization. And so a good policy or a good solution is a solution that everybody can agree on. Limited analysis here, again, it's a limited scope. It doesn't mean that it's not an in-depth analysis. There is in-depth analysis, except that the scope is a lot more narrow. It's a lot more concentrated, and focused on whatever issue or whatever theme, whatever problem it is that they have at hand. And contrary to the root method, again, there is a greatly reduced reliance on theory. I like to, I think the reduced reliance on theory is because that every context, every problem presents itself as something entirely different to the past, even though they're similar problems that the organization has faced. I often joke with my friends when we get together. friends with different academical backgrounds. They can be in law, they could be in they can be in economics and whatnot. And when we come together, we often joke that all those theories that we learned in school, all those Western theories, because most of the theories, most of the literatures are Western literature, revolving around the United States and or Europe. Europe is usually the UK. So all those Western and maybe global North theories usually they get thrown out of the window when we talk about the context of the situation here. In the global South, especially in Indonesia, a lot of those theories just go out the window. So when we're talking about contextual when we're talking about a contextual problem, sometimes we just have to, we have to not throw the theory out of the window, but we don't necessarily rely on existing theory unless those existing theories come from anywhere within the same geographical scope. But please do read this section on strategic planning and rational comprehensive planning in Getting Strategic About Strategic Planning Research, and see which parts I got mixed up. So, public sector strategic planning approaches in both theory and practice can and they do range between the root and branch methods. So most of the times in practice, just go back a little bit, most of the times in practice, when we are faced with a problem, then automatically we would think about thinking about how can we approach this problem strategically. But I don't think that these two methods, root and branch methods, should be distinct from one another. I think that we can still, come back and forth between the root and the branch methods whenever we need to. So, and that just goes to illustrate that strategic planning, as Bryson and friends mentioned, that strategic planning is not a single thing, but instead consists of a set of concepts, procedures, and tools and practices that combine in different ways to create a variety of approaches to being strategic. Now, I'll cut this section. I'll cut and highlight this section. Consists of a set of concepts, procedures, tools, and practices. In an earlier publication, also available in Classroom, entitled The Fall and Rise of Strategic Planning, the author mentioned that strategic planning is basically a synthesis of existing visions, of existing strategies and missions that are put together, compiled together to present a different way or a different approach to solving contemporary problems. And I can't agree more, because most of the times when we're presented with a problem, then we would reflect on existing solutions to similar problems, and see if we can apply that to the current problem that we have at hand. Now, moving along, there are three pitfalls or three fallacies in strategic planning that I need to warn you about. First is about prediction. I mentioned last week that urban planning is a lot more complex than rocket science, because urban planners work with predicting trends, statistical trends. And because they're working with predicting trends based on past statistical data, the plans that urban planners produce tend to be inaccurate. Well, I wouldn't say 100% inaccurate, but the plans that urban planners produce have a rather low degree of accuracy. Why is that? Because first, there is no pause button. While a plan is under development, you can't put the world on hold. The Earth still rotates and it still revolves around the sun. So when you detect a problem, when you detect a pattern that you'd like to change, you can't say, hold on, wait right there. I'm gonna develop a plan to solve that problem. The problem is not going to go away. It's just going to keep on going. Another reason is forecasting. Now, certain patterns can be predicted. If you look at the weather, if you look at seasons, or any other geographical attributes, those things can be forecasted up to a certain degree. It's going to be sunny today, by the looks of it, or seasons, for example. You can forecast the season because the seasons generally follow an observable pattern. Winter is between so and so months, summer is between so and so months, and so on and so forth. But things like technological continuity or discontinuity can't be predicted. You cannot predict. It's virtually impossible to predict technological continuity or discontinuity because technology continuously evolves, and I think we've seen a leap in technology that maybe several decades ago would have taken years to occur. Now, I think they're occurring in the snap of a finger, in the blink of an eye. So it's difficult to predict those things. Another meager thing that you can't forecast, say fashion trends. You can't forecast fashion trends, and of course, human behavior. Human behavior is something that is very difficult to forecast and virtually impossible to forecast. So therefore, when making predictions about the future based on past data, I guess you can understand why I say that plans have a low degree of accuracy. Another fallacy that we should watch out for is, or be aware of, is detachment. Now, what I mean by detachment is, think of executive summaries and market research reports. Now, those documents are great tools for delivering large amounts of information efficiently. And these summaries allow managers to never leave the office. It allows us to sit in front of our computers and conduct analysis based on whatever data is made available in those reports. Now, the problem with this behavior or this approach is detachment. If we overly rely on market research reports, statistical or census data reports, such as the ones made available by the BPS, or executive summaries, then it will detach us from what's going on out there in the world, in the real world. For us, this detachment can be detrimental to our roles as urban planners and or urban managers. Reliance on such reports will ultimately detach us from the real world. So perhaps we can use these reports, executive summaries, statistical or census data reports, market research reports, and other similar reports to get a grasp of what's going on, or have an initial feel of what's going on around us. And then afterwards, we should proceed by relying and collecting hard data such as first-hand accounts, and any other forms of information, tangible, both tangible and intangible. Now, and what I mean by tangible information, they could be, we could gather first-hand statistical data out there in the field, and or maybe first-hand accounts. Say, for example, you're dealing with post-disaster recovery, and you want to know the impact that it made on a natural hazard has made on a community. You can go around and collect first-hand accounts. What happened to you? What did you lose, and so on and so on. And then when I talk about intangible data or intangible information, things like gossip. Things like gossip and hearsay, rumors, those are intangible information. Why should we take those things into consideration? Well, because intangible information can give you an insight. It can give you an illustration, or it can help you form an illustration of people's perspectives, or the way they perceive things. For example, if you happen to formulate or develop a certain policy, and then you hear what people say about it, or people are gossiping about this, it sounds like they don't agree with it. It sounds like some of them agree with it. Another voice, another group of people actually seem to agree only if so and so is improved. So those sorts of intangible information also give an excellent insight into what people think, and thus. But afterwards, you need to recheck it, cross-check it with your tangible data or information. The third fallacy is formalization. Formalization is the rational sequence from analysis through administrative procedures to eventual action. So, analysis, administrative procedure, eventual action. This sort of mechanism is something that I'm sure you are all familiar with, because that is something that we are it is something that is integral to what we do as planners and managers. We take data, we analyze them, and the output of that analysis we put through administrative procedures to develop policies and strategies, and then eventually we follow it up with an action plan on the field. But that sort of procedure is in place for a reason, to provide accountability, transparency, and to make it possible or easier for the public to scrutinize and monitor our activities. However, but if you think of strategy making as a learning process, then the process of analysis, administrative procedure, and action can also go the opposite direction. Action, procedure, and then analysis. I like the statement, we think in order to act, to be sure, but we also act in order to think. So learning by doing, so to say. We try things, and those experiments, and then the experiments that work, they converge gradually to form viable patterns that ultimately become strategies. And I think that this is the very, very essence of strategy making as a learning process. Now, as I mentioned, that formalization is an integral part to what we do as planners and managers. So it is our moral obligation to inform the formal processes of this learning process. So we should inform this formalization process, that we should remind them that policy making, strategy making is indeed a learning process, and that way we can help ensure the delivery of more efficient and more effective services. I noted down here that formalization or formal systems often make matters worse. Think of this point here and connect it to there is no pause button. So administrative procedures often take time, and because there is no pause button, the problem will continue to develop, the problem will continue to evolve, while we can't say that, hang on, my boss is going to sign off on that policy, is going to sign off on that framework, he's going to sign off on that regulatory framework on the 10th of February or on the 20th of February, so you guys just wait. We can't do that. And then once it arrives on your boss's desk, it arrives on the 18th, and he's away until the next month. So, it takes time. Administrative procedures, red tape takes a lot of time, most of the time. That's why formal systems usually make matters worse, because there is no pause button to whatever matter it is. So that's why we need to keep reminding ourselves that strategy making, strategizing is a learning process, and we need to remind urban managers and all related parties that more often than not. Sometimes we just need to put things into action before the administrative procedure, before the regulatory framework becomes available. But hey, if there is no regulation, then we're not breaking any rules, are we? Anyways, so right. Next up is measuring the outcomes of strategic planning. In the for-profit sector or in the private sector, measuring outcomes of a strategy is relatively straightforward, because performance indicators in the for-profit sector, in the profit-oriented organizations, performance indicators are relatively straightforward. You're not selling enough products. You need to sell more products. We're not recruiting enough clients. We need to recruit. We need to recruit more clients. And how are we going to go about in selling more products? How can we get more clients, and so on? But performance in the public sector is a bit more difficult to operationalize. Why? Because the public sector consists of so many different divisions, or so many different units, so many different organizations. And each organization have different goals, have different orientations, they have different objectives, they have different purposes. And so there is no one size fits all to measure performance, or measure the outcomes of these organizations. So we need to take into account the many different types of performance outcomes of these different organizations. And if we're going to make a strategic plan that forces these different organizations to collaborate, then we also need to take into account these different performance outcomes. And thus, we need to come up with a different set of performance indicators and so on. And we also need to be aware of the likelihood of a variety of direct and indirect links between strategic planning and performance. Now, speaking of outcomes, next up, I want to talk about strategic planning success factors. There are four success factors, or four factors that influence strategic planning success: capacity, leadership, participation, and integration. That public sector organizations need to build the necessary capacity to do strategic planning. They need the skills and resources to carry out strategic planning in the public sector, and that these skills and resources should match the complexity of the processes and practices involved. And when I talk about resources, resources include financial capacity, technical knowledge and capacity. Technical knowledge and capacity means the ability to collect and analyze data and to judge between potential solutions. Now, it is difficult for public sector organizations to develop technical knowledge and capacity. It takes time. It usually takes a long time to do so. And so, therefore, we have people who provide consultancy work. And therefore, usually, public sector organizations delegate the data collection, the analysis to third parties, to third-party providers. Is that such a bad thing? No, of course not. The public sector organizations have financial capacity most of the times. They have financial capacity, but they sometimes lack the technical knowledge and capacity. Therefore, they delegate these things to third parties. Now, the people providing consultancy work will collect, analyze data, and then present the outcome to the public sector organizations, and then the organizations will then formulate or develop policies accordingly. Next factor is leadership. Now, there are different forms of leadership throughout the different layers, or throughout the different hierarchy, different levels of the organization. And but at each turn, or at each level, there is the form of leadership that takes place also affect strategic planning success greatly. Next factor is participation. And when I talk about participation, here is the participation and the contribution of all parties involved, all the stakeholders that are involved, whether it be the public sector organizations themselves, public representatives or representatives of the people, perhaps academics and whatnot. So every stakeholder have their own objectives, have their own goals, have their own values, and so which then affects, perhaps influences their level of participation, their degree of participation, and their eagerness to participate as well. And so one of the purposes of strategic planning is to elaborate, is to explain, to detail, to delineate how far each stakeholder is going to participate, and how much of their time, effort, and resources will they contribute to achieving the overall project goal. Last is integration. The integration of the strategic plan to existing regulatory and legal framework, or to existing SOPs. Now, this sort of integration does not equal compliance. It doesn't mean that your strategic plan should comply with existing regulations, with existing policies. Because who knows? Maybe your strategic plan aims to improve current policy. So if it aims to improve current policy, it's definitely not going to be in line with current regulatory frameworks. You're trying to suggest a new approach. You're trying to suggest a novel approach. You're trying to suggest improvement, and so on. So what I mean by integration is not complete. It's not a complete and seamless mesh, but it could be that one side needs to be adjusted to accommodate the new strategy. Now, strategies cannot be created by analysis. Plans can't also be created by analysis, but the development of plans and strategies can be helped by analysis and their outcome. Now, in this section, we'll talk a bit about planning, plans, and planners. Now, the planning activity itself, planning as strategic programming, as I mentioned just then, that planning can't generate strategies, but planning can program strategies and make them operational. Now, to do so, you need strategic programming. Strategic programming involves 3 steps: codification, elaboration, and conversion. I did say that strategic planning is simply taking into account all the existing strategies and all the existing measures, all the existing knowledge, experiences from past case studies, and then clarifying those strategies and re-expressing them and representing them as something new, interpreting them as something new. And that stage is called codification, where we gather all the necessary information. We gather all the different case studies that we can reflect on. Where we gather existing strategies, what has been done, what has not been done, and what were the outcomes of previous solutions and previous programs, and then we put them together and transform them into a more or we adapt them to suit the needs of contemporary issues. Now, this stage requires good interpretation and careful attention to nuance, subtlety, and qualification. Nuance, subtlety, qualification simply means that we need to pay attention to the current context. Is it suitable? Are the solutions that we found suitable for the current context, or do we need to think of something else? And once we've gathered all those resources, we break them down. Into sub-strategies or programs, and begin to match one aspect of the strategies that we found to the relevant aspect of the issue that we're trying to solve. Now, this part is called elaboration. And finally, once we have an initial draft of the strategic program that we're going to suggest, we need to take into account how these strategies or how this program may affect our organization's operations, how it may have implications on society, what are its environmental implications, what are its economic implications and whatnot, social implications, regulatory, legal implications, and so on and so forth. if there are too many friction between our proposed strategy to, let's say, there's too many there are too many frictions with the society. There are too many with societal norms, with societal values. There's too many friction with the environmental aspect, and so on and so forth. We go back to elaboration. We have to reiterate. We need to readjust. We need to rethink about the strategy, and then take it back into the conversion stage. Have we anticipated all the possible implications? And then when you find out that no, this isn't going to work, we go back to elaboration, and maybe sometimes we need to go back to codification to see if there's something that we missed. Now, strategic planning, or formulating a strategic plan, can be considered as a non-routine activity, the codification, elaboration, and conversion, because you can't predict when a problem is going to arise. You can't accurately predict trends, and so we're talking about formulating bespoke strategies to contemporary urban issues. And so on the other hand, organizations, public sector organizations like local governments, provincial governments, and so on, they have budgets and objectives that are routine to them. Every year, each organization is given so and so budget for their operations, and to provide services to society. And so when a problem arises, and when someone proposes a solution to that problem, then sometimes objectives need to be restated. Sometimes budgets need to be reworked. Policies and standard operating procedures perhaps need to be reconsidered, and sometimes even if it's not in the conversion state, even if it's gone past the codification, elaboration, and conversion, but when we propose them to the public sector organization, and they will have a look at their budgets and objectives, and perhaps they might say, this is not in line with our budgets and objectives, or this is in line with our budget, but it's not in line with our objectives and our goals. Then you might need to go back to the drawing board and recodify, re-elaborate, and reconvert. Now, of course, the product is the end product of strategic planning is plans, or planning documents. Now, these plans are prime media to communicate strategic intent and to control the pursuit of these strategic intents. And these plans also emphasize the importance of common, or the importance of group direction above individual discretion. Plans are also instrument to gain support. Written plans inform potential financiers, potential suppliers, government agencies, and other parties, other stakeholders about the intentions of an organization, so that these groups can help it achieve the goals. So it's instrumental to gaining tangible and intangible support from influential parties. Now, and then of course we need to think about our role, your future role as planners. Now, planners can be many things, but in strategic planning, then planners can be one of these three things, or maybe one or two of these three things, or maybe it can be all these three things at once. As strategy finders, remember that codification stage, when I say we need to scour, you need to scour the resources to study different or similar cases, to explore patterns, explore patterns, find patterns amid all the noise, all the useless data, all the just noise. Once you find the patterns, you might put them together in different ways, and you can discover, as strategy finders, your role is to discover new ways of perceiving or doing things. I am of the belief that humans are not capable of creation. I believe that creation is the ultimate capability of the man above, of the man upstairs. Us humans, we only take what we observe from nature, what we observe from existing conditions or previous similar situations, and we turn them into new things. So we're more of repackaging things and reintroducing them as something new, rather than totally creating something new. Planners as analysts. Well, I think this is pretty straightforward. You gather data, you analyze them, and then you present them to your clients for them to consider the results and for them to use these results in their strategy making process. One that is interesting is the planners as catalysts. Now, more often than not, the solution is there already for everyone to peruse. But sometimes people don't see it that way. So what I mean by planners as catalysts is planners can encourage managers or encourage people to think about the future in different ways or in creative ways by asking the right questions. So what if we, or maybe, do you know, what do you think of this approach? Can this be applied here, or rather than can this be applied here? How can we apply this solution here? How can we apply that one there? What are its pitfalls? What are its strengths? What are its drawbacks, and so on? Sometimes all planners need to do is to catalyze the right discussion, to start the right discussion. Sometimes we don't need to find. Sometimes we don't even need to become strategy finders. By simply fostering the right type of discussion. And so, since we can't predict, since we can't accurately forecast, strategies should be left as broad visions. We shouldn't try to precisely articulate a strategy. Or this is the absolute strategy for homelessness. No, it's not going to work. It may work in your area, but it may not work in other areas. And it may work now in your area, but in the future, should a similar situation arise, it may not work then, because the environment always changes. So, as Mintzberg, and I'd like to reiterate what Mintzberg has said, that sometimes strategies should be left as broad visions and not precisely articulated to adapt to a changing environment. Because there is no pause button. Now, there are several ways to go about formulating strategies, but I've already provided you with a video in classroom about strategic planning using the humble SWOT matrix. Well, I wouldn't really say humble, but it's just something that I'm sure you're all familiar with already. You may use the SWOT analysis with other forms of analysis. Take a look back at community development class. You might combine it with root cause analysis and other forms of issue identifying tools. And then put them together in the strengths and opportunities, strengths and threats, and weakness, opportunities, weakness, threats analysis. Now, moving along to the action plan. Now, the action plan is very straightforward. There's not much. I'm not going to present much theory here because it's a very hands-on thing. Quite simply put, the action plan or an action plan consists of steps that must be taken or tasks that must be performed well for a strategy to succeed. Now, there are several different references mention different levels or different stages in compiling an action plan. But I actually compiled the next steps of creating an action plan, or the step-by-step to creating an action plan from this particular publication, the CAPE Action Plan for the Environment by Young and Fawkes, which is also available in our classroom. The CAPE Action Plan for the Environment consists of 5 goals. So the first is to identify conservation priorities. Second is to develop a long-term strategy for diversity conservation, and then draft a 5-year action plan and investment program for conservational priorities. Identify potential sources of funding for conservation activities, and then the last one is to involve the key stakeholders meaningfully throughout the conservation process. From this publication, you can have a look at it in depth, download it from Classroom. But from this publication, I came up with 8 steps to creating an action plan. The first step was to define project goals. Define the high-level goals that a project will achieve. You've drafted a strategic plan. What's the goal of the strategic plan? So the goals that are stated in the action plan should be aligned with the strategic plan, goals, and of course, perhaps business objectives of your particular organization. Once you define the high-level goals, you can move on to defining the project objectives, or the project deliverables, or the milestones that need to be completed to achieve the project goal. And then third step is to define action steps. Now, what I mean by action steps, the action steps are a group of related tasks or action items that must be executed to produce the project deliverables. And then identify and prioritize action items. So a little different to action steps. Action items are small individual tasks that make up the action steps that are outlined within the action plan. So you do need to identify task dependencies among these actions, among these steps, and then assign those action items priority levels so that they're executed sequentially. It may not always be that, but from these, from the description that I provided, steps 2, 3, and 4 are generally intertwined. You can group these 3 steps into to form a single group. So instead of 8 steps, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 steps. You put these three steps together. The fifth step is to define roles and responsibilities, and I think that's pretty straightforward. You identify who the project actors or stakeholders are and what they do, or you can elaborate what they can do to contribute to the project, and so on. And then, of course, your action plan definitely has resource requirements. And so having identified your action steps and action items will help you understand what resources are needed for each task and allocate accordingly. Step number 7 is monitoring and evaluation. Now, any action plan needs to be monitored and controlled to measure its performance. Now, and this is why it's important for you to have SMART goals for your action items, action steps, and your project objectives. Now, what I mean by SMART goals is not SMART is actually an acronym. The S is for specific. M is for measurable. A is for attainable, I think. And then R is relevant. And T is timely. So specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely goals, SMART goals. And if you have such SMART goals, it will be a lot easier to monitor and evaluate each step of the way. Finally, timeline. Once you've got your goals and everything, you need to set a timeline. You need to do your best to estimate how long it'll take to complete your action items and action steps. Once you do so, you will have a proper timeline. And I guess the timeline would more or less look like this. Here you have the details of each task, or the names of each task, and here you have the time and duration, when each task should start, when it should end, and more specifically the dates and so on. Now, now the action plan can take on many forms, but it is good to be able. It will be a big help if you lay out your action plan in the form of a matrix. Then this sort of matrix, this sort of table, will help you then elaborate your action plan as a narrative and whatnot. So here you have the goal, the ultimate goal, whether it's to eradicate poverty in cities, or to minimize or to erase the house, to overcome the housing backlog issue in cities. And how are you going to eradicate poverty? Well, first of all, you need to give them better access to housing. Maybe give them better. Objective number 2 is to give them better opportunities, and so on. And how are you going to what are the tasks you need to do to ensure a better access? Who are the actors responsible, or who are the actors or stakeholders? Who are the actors or stakeholders that are influential in providing better access to housing for the poor? And what sort of resources do you need? And then timeline, and then performance indicators and whatnot. So your action plan may look different to this, but this is just an example of, this is just one of many examples. If you look at action plan template, if you Google action plan template, you get thousands, if not millions, of results. And I think you could just tailor those templates to your specific needs. But I guess this is the way I would illustrate what an action plan table would look like. And you're more than welcome to use and modify this as extensively as needed. Right. So I think that's all that I have for you at the moment. Next week, we will be entering the case study introductions, where you introduce your case studies to the class. What I need you to do is to begin researching your a case study if you haven't done so already, and to develop an initial draft and prepare a brief presentation to the class. Now, as for consultation, I'd expect at least one consultation prior to presentation. But if you need to consult with me more than once, I'm more than welcome to do so. More than welcome to accommodate. Now, about the presentation, I also need to tell you a little bit about the presentation plans. Now, I think I mentioned last week that we will have two presentations a week. I've made this document available in Classroom. I have finalized the assessment criteria for you to follow. Hopefully, those assessment criteria are clear enough for you. If you don't understand any of the assessment criteria, you can come to me. For assistance. Now, next week, I've arranged the topics to be somewhat complementary. So urbanization, urban sprawl, and megacities take up a lot of land, or they demand a lot of land. And so I put urbanization, urban sprawl, and megacities with urban land management theme. And in the upcoming week, fourth week, it's urban infrastructure and housing. And week 5, poverty and conflict management. 6 is urban heritage and revitalization. Those two go hand in hand. Very nicely. And then 7, and then finally, the final case study introduction is disaster management in week 8. Now, since we only have 11 themes, then disaster management stands alone. But in week 8, after we discuss disaster management, we can then reflect on perhaps what can be improved in the second half of the semester by reflecting on the presentations that have taken place between weeks 3 and 8. So we use this time after disaster management to reflect. And then urbanization, urban sprawl presents again, but this time, not case study introduction, but plausible solutions, and presenting plausible solutions and their strategy and action, the actions taken to put the solution into action. So, following the same order as the previous few weeks, we start with urbanization, sprawl, megacities, and urban land management, and we will end with disaster management. We will reflect again on the proceedings, and then you will produce a final draft for peer review workshop. Now, what I mean by final draft is not final draft, because we still have a peer review workshop, which I showed you last week, which is using the workshop module in my ITS classroom. I have begun to set up the assessment criteria here. I've simplified it, of course, so that it could fit into the workshop module rubrics. In Classroom. That way, you can read each other's work, and then provide constructive feedback to your peers, and then ultimately grade them as well. And then in week 16, it's a wrap up. This is where you submit your final document. I don't think you need to submit anything here. You don't need to submit your final draft here. You submit your final draft to the peer workshop, then you revise it, and then you after that you you submit it into Classroom just right on just under the introduction or the general section when you first land in our Classroom page. Right, but things could probably change as we go along. So that's my strategy for this class. I'm not. It may not be too rigid. And once again, I think I haven't shown you the final what's it called, assessment criteria. I think last time I gave you a glimpse of what the assessment criteria. I think I showed you guys this. The introduction, identification of issues, references, and document format. For the final draft, the assessment criteria, I've added to the assessment criteria because there are more sections in the essay. So introduction, identification of issue, plausible solutions, strategic plan, action plan, references, and document format. So there are more assessment criteria to fulfill. And I have tried to make the criterion as easy to follow as possible. But again, have a look through it. If there are things that you feel you're not too confident about, that you don't really understand, then you're more than welcome to come to me and talk about it. Right. Yeah. I think that is all that I have for you right now. If you have any questions or comments, then you're more than welcome to do so. But while waiting for any questions or comments to arise, for those of you who are late to join, please do scan the QR code and to mark your attendance. And it's all rosy and pinky because simply today is that particular day of the year, which I don't particularly like. But happy Valentine's Day anyways. Right, any questions or comments? Right, well, perhaps there are no questions or comments as of yet, but I remind you to please take a look at the semester plan document that I've uploaded to Classroom. If you do have any questions or comments regarding that, have a read through it, digest it first, and once you've and if there's anything that is a bit unclear, then you know how to reach me. Otherwise, thank you very much for attending today's session. And I have caught news that some of us are not well, and therefore the campus is right now under lockdown for the next couple of weeks. For those of you who are feeling under the weather, I wish you speedy recovery. It would be really nice to be able to see you guys again in class, as we did some time ago. Other than that, thanks again. Have a great day, everyone. Take care of yourselves. Have a great afternoon. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.